I stood in the kitchen that Sunday morning, watching the steam curl up from Franklin's coffee like a ghost rising from a grave. My hand was steady. That surprised me. After 37 years of trembling under his voice, under his fists, under the weight of his contempt, I thought my hands would shake when this moment finally came. But they didn't. The little tin sat open on the counter, its contents pale as ash. I'd kept it hidden in the back of the spice cabinet for 6 months, tucked behind the cardamom he never let me use because he said it smelled like dirt. Everything I loved smelled wrong to Franklin. Tasted wrong. Looked wrong. Eventually, I learned that I was wrong too, just by existing in his world. I poured exactly half a teaspoon into his mug. The powder disappeared into the dark liquid without a trace, like secrets dissolving into silence. That's what our marriage had been, hadn't it? My pain dissolving into quiet, over and over, until I wasn't sure I existed anymore except as something to absorb his anger. Franklin was in the living room, reading the Sunday paper, like this was just another ordinary morning. Like he hadn't called me a worthless cow the night before. Like he hadn't grabbed my wrist so hard it left 4 purple fingerprints that I'd have to cover with long sleeves all week. The coffee pot gurgled its last breath. I added his cream, 2 sugars, exactly the way he demanded. Any variation, and he'd throw the whole mug at the wall, make me clean it up while he watched and laughed. Would you have done the same if you were in her shoes? Tell me in the comments. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. I carried the mug into the living room. My footsteps made no sound on the carpet. I'd learned to walk like a ghost in my own home because Franklin hated the sound of my presence. He hated most things about me, actually, but he never let me leave. Said no one else would want a dried-up old woman like me. Said I should be grateful he kept me around at all. Took you long enough, he muttered without looking up from the sports section. His jowls shook when he talked now, flesh hanging from the bones of the handsome man I'd married. Time had been cruel to Franklin Langford, but not nearly as cruel as he'd been to me. I set the mug on the side table, my fingers releasing it like I was letting go of something much heavier than ceramic and coffee. Maybe I was. He reached for it without acknowledgement, without thanks, the way you'd reach for something that had always been there and always would be. His property. His servant. His punching bag wrapped in an apron and a forced smile. The mug touched his lips. He took that first sip. I held my breath. His face changed. Not dramatically, just a small crease between his eyebrows, a pause in his swallowing. He pulled the mug away and stared into it like the coffee had personally offended him. What did you put in this? His voice was sharp, suspicious. Franklin's voice was always sharp, always cutting, always designed to make me feel small. I should have felt afraid. For 37 years, that tone would have sent ice through my veins, would have made me stammer out apologies, would have made me rush to make him a fresh cup. Better this time. Perfect this time. Please don't be angry this time. But standing there in the morning light streaming through windows I'd cleaned 1,000 times, watching him hold that mug like it might bite him back, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Calm. Pure, crystalline calm. I moved closer, slowly, until I was standing right beside his chair. Close enough that he had to look up at me. Close enough that for once I was the one looking down. My voice came out steady, quiet, cold as January rain. Just a little something to help you remember what bitterness tastes like. His eyes went wide. Actually wide. I'd never seen Franklin look uncertain before, never seen fear flicker across those features that had sneered at me through countless dinners, countless arguments, countless nights when I cried myself to sleep in the guest room because sharing a bed with him felt like lying down with a snake. And suddenly I was 24 again, standing in my mother's kitchen, watching Franklin Langford smile at me like I was the only woman in the world worth saving. Franklin Langford walked into my mother's kitchen like he owned the summer itself. 24 years old, and he had that confidence, that easy charm that made everyone in Fairhaven turn their heads. He was helping my father fix the porch, shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat on his brow, looking like every girl's dream of a man who could build things and fix things and make everything right. "You must be Marjorie," he said, and his smile could have melted ice in December. I was arranging flowers in a vase. Wildflowers from the field behind our house, nothing fancy, just something to make the kitchen feel alive. My hands were stained green from the stems. "That's me," I said, suddenly aware of how plain I looked, how ordinary, how completely unremarkable compared to this man who seemed to glow with possibility. He stepped closer, looked at the flowers like they were masterpieces in a museum. "You've got an artist's touch. These are beautiful." No one had ever called anything I did beautiful before. My mother said I was practical. My father said I was reliable. My teachers said I was adequate. But beautiful? That word felt like sunlight after years of shade. We married 6 months later. Everyone said we were perfect together. Franklin Langford, the ambitious young businessman, and Marjorie Wilson, the sweet girl who'd make him the perfect wife. I believed it too. Believed I'd won some kind of lottery. Believed the way he held my hand meant he'd hold my heart just as gently. The first year was everything a marriage should be. He brought me flowers every Friday. Called me during his lunch breaks just to hear my voice. Made love to me like I was precious, breakable, worth protecting. I thought I'd found safety in his arms. If you've ever seen love turn into control, type "I understand" in the comments. The first time Franklin raised his voice at me, we'd been married 14 months. I'd burned the roast. Just overcooked it a little, made it dry instead of tender. An honest mistake, the kind everyone makes when they're still learning. He didn't hit me. Not that time. He just stood up from the dinner table, so fast his chair fell backward. Stared at me like I'd committed murder instead of overcooking beef. "Are you stupid?" 3 words. Quiet. Deadly. "Are you actually stupid, Marjorie?" I apologized. Stammered through explanations about the oven temperature, about the recipe, about how I'd try harder next time. My voice got smaller with every word until I wasn't sure I was making sound anymore. He left the table. Didn't eat. Didn't speak to me for 2 days. When he finally did talk to me again, it was to tell me his mother never burned a roast in 40 years of marriage. That a real wife would know how to feed her husband properly. That maybe I needed to try harder if I wanted to keep him happy. I promised I would. And I meant it. Because I still believed that if I could just be better, do better, love him better, everything would go back to the way it was during that golden first year. I didn't understand yet that the golden year was the trap. The sweetness was bait. And I'd already been caught. The yelling became regular. Once a week, then twice, then so often I stopped counting. My cooking was wrong. My cleaning was wrong. The way I folded his shirts, answered the phone, wore my hair, laughed too loud, breathed too heavy. Everything about me became an offense. But he still hadn't hit me. I told myself that meant something. Told myself we were fine, just adjusting, just learning each other's rough edges. Told myself lies until they felt like truth. Then came the night I dropped his mother's china plate. It slipped from my soapy hands, shattered across the kitchen floor in 1,000 irreparable pieces. I stared at the fragments, knowing what was coming, feeling it in the air like electricity before lightning strikes. Franklin appeared in the doorway, looked at the broken plate, looked at me, smiled. That smile was worse than any scream. It was the smile of a man who'd finally been given permission for something he'd been wanting to do all along. He grabbed my hair so fast I didn't have time to flinch, dragged me down to the floor, my knees hitting tiles so hard I saw stars. Shoved my face toward the broken pieces. "Pick it up," he whispered, still smiling. "Pick up every single piece with your bare hands. And if you miss even one, I'll make sure you regret it." I picked up the pieces. Cut my fingers in 3 places. Bled onto the white tile while Franklin stood over me, watching, satisfied. When I finished, he patted my head like I was a dog who'd finally learned a trick. That night, lying in bed next to him, listening to him snore like nothing had happened, I made a promise to myself. I'd be so good, so perfect, so exactly what he needed that he'd never have a reason to hurt me again. I didn't understand yet that men like Franklin don't need reasons. They just need someone who won't fight back. Once a man knows your silence is his weapon, he'll use it again and again. The years folded into each other like sheets I'd washed and rewashed until the patterns faded. 25 became 30, became 35, became 40. Time passed, but nothing changed except the depth of my silence and the creativity of Franklin's cruelty. He never hit me where anyone could see. Never left marks that couldn't be covered by long sleeves or high collars or carefully applied makeup.
He was smart about it.
Careful. The kind of careful that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and enjoying it. But the words were worse than the bruises. Words leave marks that never fade, never yellow, never heal. They just settle into your bones and become part of your skeleton. You're worthless. You're lucky I keep you around. No one else would want you. You're too old, too stupid, too ugly, too boring. He'd say these things over breakfast, over dinner, in bed at night, sometimes while smiling, like they were compliments instead of assassinations. And after years of hearing them, I started to believe every single word. I stopped calling my friends, stopped seeing my mother, stopped existing anywhere except inside Franklin's carefully constructed prison, disguised as a marriage. He didn't forbid me from having a life outside our house. He was too smart for that. He just made it easier to stay home, made it hurt less to disappear. The only place I had left was the garden. I started at the summer I turned 43, after Franklin told me I was too fat and too boring to be seen in public. I needed something to do with my hands, something to grow instead of watching everything inside me wither. The garden became my world. Tomatoes and herbs and flowers that bloomed despite the shade, despite the poor soil, despite everything trying to kill them. I understood those flowers. We were survivors, them and me, growing in hostile territory. Franklin hated the garden at first, said I was wasting time playing in the dirt like a child. But then his business partners started commenting on how beautiful the yard looked, and suddenly the garden was his idea, his accomplishment, his property like everything else. Share the story to remind someone that silence can be power. The humiliation got worse as we got older. He'd invite colleagues over for dinner and spend the entire evening telling stories that made me the punchline. How I couldn't balance a checkbook. How I'd once gotten lost driving to the grocery store. How I was afraid of spiders and mice and anything with more than 4 legs. Everyone would laugh. Polite laughter, uncomfortable laughter, but laughter nonetheless. And I'd smile and serve dessert and pretend my insides weren't screaming. One night, after a particularly brutal dinner party where Franklin told everyone I'd failed 11th grade twice, a complete lie, I knelt in the grass and touched one of the delicate petals, soft as silk, pretty as a painting, deadly as a bullet, because I knew what foxglove was. My grandmother had taught me about poisonous plants when I was young, back when she still grew herbs and remedies in her own garden. Beautiful things can kill you, she'd said, holding up a foxglove flower just like this one. Nature doesn't warn you with ugly. Sometimes the most dangerous things look like gifts. Foxglove. Digitalis purpurea. Every part of it toxic. Leaves, flowers, seeds, roots. A person could dry them, grind them into powder, and have themselves a weapon that looked like seasoning. I sat back on my heels and stared at those purple bells, my mind going places it had never gone before. Have you ever seen beauty hide danger before? Let me know below. I didn't touch the foxglove again for weeks. Just looked at it every morning when I came out to water the tomatoes. It grew taller, more flowers blooming, more seeds forming. Nature providing exactly what nature provides, indifferent to how humans might use its gifts. Franklin got worse that month. One of his business deals fell through, and he needed someone to blame. That someone was always me. He broke my favorite mug, the one my mother had given me, threw it at the wall while screaming about how I'd ruined his life, how marrying me was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. I cleaned up the pieces. Again. Always again. My life was just cleaning up broken things Franklin destroyed, while telling me it was my fault they broke. That night, I looked out the kitchen window at the foxglove glowing pale in the moonlight. Thought about my grandmother's words. thought about how tired I was, how small I'd become, how much of myself I'd lost trying to please a man who enjoyed my suffering. The neighbor's cat disappeared the next week. Mrs. Chen knocked on the door, asking if I'd seen Whiskers, her orange tabby who never wandered far from home. No, I told her truthfully. I haven't seen him. 3 days later, they found Whiskers under the hedge that separated our properties. Dead. No marks on him, just gone. The vet said it looked like he'd eaten something toxic. Probably rat poison, though no one in the neighborhood used it. I stood at my kitchen window, staring at the foxglove, and something cold settled in my chest. Mrs. Chun cried for a week. I brought her a casserole and let her sob on my shoulder about how Whiskers had been her companion for 12 years, how she'd never get over losing him, how sudden death was the cruelest kind. At least he didn't suffer, I said, patting her back. But I was lying. I had no idea if the cat suffered or not. Had no idea what foxglove poisoning felt like, whether it was quick or slow, painful or peaceful. I needed to know. The library became my sanctuary that month. Franklin thought I'd joined a book club. I encouraged him to believe it. Let him make jokes about me finally developing a brain in my old age. Let him think he'd won again by making me feel stupid for trying to better myself. Instead, I read. Not novels. Not romances or mysteries, or any of the things Franklin thought would appeal to a simple woman like me. I read about plants, about poisons, about exactly what digitalis does to the human body, about dosage and symptoms, and how Victorian women used to touch the leaves to make their pupils dilate, make themselves more beautiful, even though it could kill them. I learned that foxglove had been used in medicine for centuries. Small amounts could regulate a heartbeat. Large amounts could stop one forever. I learned that the symptoms started with nausea, confusion, vision problems. That death wasn't quick. That it could take hours or days, depending on the dose. I learned that it would be a terrible way to die. I also learned that just a tiny amount, not enough to kill, could make someone very, very sick. Sick enough to fear for their life. Sick enough to wonder if every cup of coffee, every meal, every moment might be their last. I walked home from the library that day with my head full of knowledge I'd never wanted, but somehow needed. That evening, I went to the garden with scissors and a small tin that used to hold breath mints. I cut several foxglove leaves, careful not to touch them with my bare skin. Laid them on a screen in the garage where Franklin never went. They dried for 2 weeks, crisp and brittle as old paper. I ground them into powder using a mortar and pestle I'd bought at a yard sale specifically for this purpose. The powder was pale, almost gray, fine as flour. I poured it into the tin, closed the lid, held it in my palm like I was weighing something heavier than dried plants, stood in my garage, surrounded by Franklin's tools and Franklin's car and Franklin's everything, holding the only thing that was entirely mine. I looked at the deadly flour powder and murmured the words that had been growing inside me for months, maybe years, maybe my entire married life. Maybe silence isn't enough anymore. I didn't use the powder right away. Just knowing it existed was enough at first. The tin sat in the back of the kitchen drawer, behind the measuring spoons Franklin never touched, and the cookie cutters I never used anymore because Franklin said baking cookies was a waste of time. Every morning, I'd open that drawer to get a spoon for my coffee. See the tin. Feel a strange flutter in my chest that was half fear, half something I didn't want to name. Power, maybe. The dangerous kind. I started watching Franklin differently. Not as a victim watching her tormentor, but as a scientist studying a specimen. When did he drink his coffee? Always at 7:15, after his shower, before checking his email. What did he eat for breakfast? Toast, dry, no butter because he was watching his cholesterol. When was he most vulnerable? In the morning, groggy, not fully awake yet. I made notes in my head, cataloged his patterns like I was preparing for an exam. Franklin was a creature of habit, predictable as sunrise, and that predictability was his weakness. But I wasn't ready yet. Wasn't sure I'd ever be ready. The tin stayed in the drawer, untouched, a promise or a threat, I hadn't decided which. What would you do if years of pain left you with one silent choice? Franklin's cruelty continued its familiar rhythm. He told me I was getting old and ugly, that my body disgusted him, that he stayed with me out of pity, not love. These weren't new insults. I'd heard variations of them for decades, but they hit differently now. Now I had a choice. Now I had the tin. I started experimenting with harmless things first, testing myself, testing him, seeing if I could actually do what my mind kept whispering about. I made him chamomile tea one evening, told him it would help him sleep. He drank it without question, never asking why I was suddenly so concerned about his rest. Men like Franklin assume service is their birthright. They don't question gifts from the people they've broken. The next week, I added valerian root to his dinner, just a little, ground up fine and mixed into the sauce. He ate it all, complained the chicken was bland, but finished every bite. He slept deeply that night. So deeply I stood over him, watching his chest rise and fall, wondering if I could smother him with a pillow and make it look natural. I didn't. But the fact that I'd thought about it, seriously considered it, told me something about how far I'd traveled from the girl who'd married Franklin 37 years ago. I went back to the library. Read more. Not about poisons this time, but about psychology. About abusive relationships. About why women stay, why they break, why they sometimes snap in ways that shock everyone except themselves. The librarian, a young woman named Sarah with kind eyes, noticed me always in the same section. "Heavy reading," she said one afternoon, glancing at the stack of books I was returning. "You okay?" I smiled, the smile I'd perfected over decades. The one that said everything is fine even when everything was burning. "Just curious," I said. Never too old to learn new things. She didn't look convinced, but didn't push. People never push. They see what they want to see, believe what's easiest to believe. No one wants to think the quiet woman checking out books about poisonous plants might actually be planning something. I wasn't planning anything. Not really. I was just preparing. There's a difference. Franklin announced we were having brunch with his brother's family that Sunday. Demanded I make something impressive because his sister-in-law always made him look bad with her fancy cooking. "Try not to embarrass me," he said, like it was a reasonable request instead of a threat. I smiled. Nodded. "Of course, Franklin. I'll make something special." That week, I practiced. Made coffee after coffee, experimenting with flavors that might hide a bitter undertone. Cinnamon helped. So did extra sugar. A splash of vanilla extract. Small adjustments that wouldn't raise suspicion but would mask almost anything. Friday night, Franklin came home angry about something at work. Started yelling before he even took off his coat. Called me a lazy cow who sat around all day doing nothing while he worked himself to death supporting my worthless existence. I stood at the stove, stirring sauce, listening to him rage. Used to, I would have cried, would have apologized, would have tried to fix whatever I'd supposedly done wrong. Instead, I thought about the tin in the drawer, about Sunday morning, about coffee and powder, and the look on Franklin's face when he realized, maybe for the first time in his life, that he wasn't in control anymore. That night, I took the tin out of the drawer, held it in both hands. The weight of it had nothing to do with the dried foxglove inside, and everything to do with what it represented. A choice. My choice. The first real choice I'd made in decades. I opened the tin, looked at the pale powder, closed it again, put it back in the drawer, but this time in the front, within easy reach. Sunday was 2 days away. Brunch was at 11. Franklin would want his coffee at 7:15 like always. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the tools of the servitude I'd performed for 37 years, and whispered to the empty room. "When the time comes, I'll be ready." Sunday morning arrived with the kind of perfect weather that makes people believe in God. Clear skies, warm sunshine, birds singing in the garden like they were celebrating something. Maybe they were celebrating what I was about to do. Maybe nature recognizes its own kind of justice. I woke up at 5:30, 2 hours before Franklin's alarm.
Couldn't sleep anyway.
My heart was beating steady but loud, like drums announcing something important was about to happen. I went to the kitchen in my nightgown, bare feet cold on the tile floor. Opened the drawer, took out the tin, set it on the counter next to the coffee maker. Then I just stood there, staring at it. This was the moment. After months of thinking, planning, preparing, this was when I'd find out who I really was. Whether I was still Marjorie the victim or whether I'd become something else entirely. The coffee maker gurgled to life. Dark liquid dripped into the pot, filling the kitchen with that bitter smell Franklin loved. The smell of every morning for 37 years. The smell of routine and repetition and silent suffering. I poured his mug, added the cream, measured the sugar. My hands were steady. That's what surprised me most. After all those years of shaking under his anger, my hands were completely still. The tin sat there, waiting, asking a question I'd been avoiding my whole married life. What are you willing to do to be free? I opened it. The powder looked harmless.
Could have been anything.
Could have been cinnamon or nutmeg, or any of a dozen spices Franklin wouldn't know the difference between. Half a teaspoon. That's what I'd calculated. Not enough to kill, just enough to terrify. Enough to make him wonder if every meal might be his last. Enough to give him a taste of the fear he'd fed me for decades. Would you keep watching to see what happens next? Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. My hand moved before my brain could second guess. Half a teaspoon of pale powder into the dark coffee. A spoon to stir it, dissolving evidence like it had never existed. Everything looked normal. Smelled normal. Franklin would never know the difference until it was too late. I carried the mug to the living room. Franklin was already up, showered, sitting in his chair reading the paper like this was just another Sunday. Like he hadn't spent the previous night telling me I was worthless. Like he hadn't grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a bruise shaped like his fingers. Took you long enough, he said. Same words as always. Same tone. Same complete disregard for my existence except as something to serve him. I set the mug down on the side table. Watched him reach for it without looking, without thanks, without any acknowledgement that I was even human. The mug touched his lips.
He drank.
1 swallow.
2.
3. Then he stopped. Pulled the mug away from his mouth and stared into it like something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. What did you put in this? His voice had that edge, that sharpness that usually made me scramble to apologize. But I didn't scramble. Didn't apologize. Didn't do any of the things I'd done for 37 years. Instead, I stepped closer. Looked down at him sitting in his chair, this man who'd spent decades making sure I knew my place was beneath him. Just a little something to help you remember what bitterness tastes like, I said.
My voice was calm.
Cold. Nothing like the trembling apologies he was used to hearing.
His face changed.
Confusion first, then something I'd never seen before in Franklin's eyes.
Fear.
Real, genuine, bone-deep fear. He looked at the mug. Looked at me. Looked at the mug again. What did you do? His voice cracked on the last word. I smiled. Not a big smile, not theatrical or cruel. Just a small curve of my lips that said everything I'd been too afraid to say for decades. Drink up, Franklin. You've always loved my coffee. He set the mug down like it was a bomb. Stood up so fast his paper fell to the floor. Grabbed my shoulders, shook me hard enough to make my teeth rattle. What did you put in my coffee? Screaming now. But underneath the anger was something new.
Panic.
The kind of panic that comes from realizing you might not be in control anymore. I didn't fight his grip. Just looked at him steadily. This man who'd hurt me 1,000 times and never thought twice about it. The same thing I've been putting in your food for weeks. I lied. Just took you this long to notice. His hands dropped from my shoulders like I'd burned him. His face went pale. Actually pale. All the color draining out like someone had pulled a plug. You're lying, he said, but his voice shook. Am I? I bent down, picked up his mug, held it out to him. Finish it and find out. He backed away from me. Franklin Langford, who'd never backed away from anything in his life, took 3 steps backward like I was the dangerous one. And for the first time in 37 years, I felt powerful. Franklin didn't go to brunch. Called his brother, said he wasn't feeling well. Spent the whole day watching me like I was a snake that might strike any second. I went about my business like nothing had changed, made myself breakfast, eggs and toast, ate slowly, savored every bite. Franklin watched from the doorway, eyes wide, wondering if I'd poisoned my own food too, or if I had some kind of antidote he didn't know about. I didn't. There was no antidote needed, because there was nothing to cure. But he didn't know that. And his not knowing was the whole point. I think I should go to the hospital, he said around noon. His voice was small, uncertain. Nothing like the booming authority I'd lived under for decades. Why? I asked, looking up from my book. You feeling okay? You know why. He was sweating now, even though the house was cool. You poisoned me. Did I? I turned the page, casual as could be. Or are you just feeling guilty about something? If you believe karma always finds its way, hit the like button. That night, Franklin didn't sleep. I heard him pacing the bedroom, heard him in the bathroom throwing up even though there was nothing in his stomach. Fear can make you sick all on its own. I'd learned that lesson from him. Now he was learning it from me. The next morning, I made him breakfast. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast. Set the plate in front of him at the kitchen table. He stared at it like I'd served him a death sentence. I can't eat this, he said. Why not? You know why. I shrugged. Suit yourself. More for me. I took a piece of bacon from his plate, ate it right in front of him, smiled while I chewed. He pushed back from the table, so hard his chair fell over. This isn't funny, Marjorie. If you actually poison me, you'll go to jail. You understand that? You'll spend the rest of your life in prison. Only if someone finds out, I said. And who's going to believe that quiet little Marjorie Langford poisoned her husband? Everyone in this town thinks I'm a doormat. Thinks you're the successful businessman who generously keeps his simple wife around even though she's not much to look at. The truth of my words hit him like a slap. Because it was true. That's exactly what everyone thought. Franklin had spent 37 years making sure people saw me as helpless, as someone who needed him. He'd built my cage, so well that now it was trapping him instead. He went to his office, called his doctor. I could hear him through the door, stammering about maybe eating something bad, maybe feeling strange. Could they fit him in for an appointment? They could. That afternoon at 3. Franklin left without telling me where he was going, like keeping secrets would somehow protect him. I watched him drive away, hands shaking on the steering wheel of his expensive car. I went to my garden, pulled weeds, watered the tomatoes, checked on the foxglove, which was growing wilder than ever, purple bells swaying in the breeze like they were applauding. Franklin came home at 5. Looked exhausted, defeated. What did the doctor say? I asked, knowing full well what the doctor had said. He ran tests, blood work, everything. Franklin collapsed into his chair, suddenly looking 10 years older. Said, I'm fine. Perfectly healthy. Nothing wrong with me at all. That's wonderful news, I said brightly. I was worried about you. He looked at me with such confusion, such complete bewilderment. This was a man who'd always understood the rules, always known his place at the top of our personal hierarchy. Now the rules had changed, and he didn't know how to play anymore. Are you going to kill me? He asked. Quietly, like a child asking if monsters are real. I sat down across from him, looked him dead in the eyes. I don't know yet. Depends on whether you give me a reason to. The next week was beautiful. Not because anything changed on the outside, but because everything changed on the inside. Franklin started doing his own laundry, started making his own meals, started checking every lock in the house before bed, like locks could keep him safe from the danger already living inside his walls. He stopped yelling at me, stopped grabbing me, stopped all the casual cruelty that had been as natural to him as breathing. Started saying please. Started saying thank you. Started treating me like a human being instead of property. Not because he'd learned, not because he'd changed, but because he was terrified. His business started to suffer. He couldn't focus on work when he was spending all his energy wondering if each meal might be his last. His partners called, concerned. His brother stopped by, asked if everything was okay. Fine, Franklin told him. Everything's fine. But everything wasn't fine. Everything was falling apart. And I was the one holding the hammer. Franklin tried to leave me 3 weeks after that Sunday morning coffee. Packed a bag, said he was going to stay at his brother's place for a while. Said we needed space. Said he couldn't live like this anymore. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching him throw shirts into a suitcase. Expensive shirts I'd washed and ironed for decades. Shirts I'd folded perfectly because imperfection meant punishment. You can't leave, I said. Not angry, not upset, just stating a fact. He spun around. Watch me. I'm done, Marjorie. I'm done with whatever sick game you're playing. I'm done being afraid in my own house. Afraid, I repeated, tasting the word. That's interesting. How do you think I've felt for 37 years? He froze. Suitcase half-packed. Hands still gripping a pair of pants. That was different, he said, but his voice was weak.
How?
I stepped into the room. How is it different, Franklin? Because you're a man and I'm a woman? Because you made the money and I just cleaned the house? Because your fists and your words were somehow more acceptable than whatever you think I put in your coffee? I never, he started. You never what? Never hit me? We both know that's a lie. Never hurt me? We both know that's an even bigger lie. Never made me wish I was dead? Because there were nights, Franklin. So many nights I lay in that bed next to you and prayed I wouldn't wake up in the morning. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Really seeing me. Not the woman he'd married, not the servant he'd trained, but the person he'd broken and never bothered to check if the pieces still fit together. If you've ever walked away from someone who hurt you, comment stronger now. I didn't know, he whispered. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. He sat down on the bed, still holding his pants, looking lost. What do you want from me? Nothing, I said and meant it. I don't want anything from you anymore, Franklin. That's the whole point. I'm done wanting, done hoping, done trying to be good enough for a man who is never good enough for me. Then let me leave.
No.
Why not? I smiled. Because watching you suffer is the first thing that's made me happy in decades. And I've earned a little happiness, don't you think? He dropped the pants. You're crazy. You've actually lost your mind. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I finally found it after 37 years of you trying to convince me I didn't have one. Franklin's brother came by the next day. James had always been the nicer one, the one who occasionally asked if I was okay when Franklin's temper got loud enough for others to hear. Marjorie, he said, standing on the porch. Franklin called. He's worried about himself. Said things have been strange around here. Strange how? I asked, all innocence. He thinks you might be trying to hurt him. I laughed. Actually laughed. The sound surprised even me. James, do I look like someone who could hurt Franklin? Your brother outweighs me by 80 pounds. He spent our entire marriage telling everyone how weak and stupid I am. What exactly do you think I could do to him? James looked uncomfortable. He mentioned something about poison. About you putting something in his food. Did he? I shook my head sadly. The doctor says he's healthy. I think the stress from work might be getting to him, making him paranoid. You know how he gets when a business deal doesn't go his way. James nodded slowly, because he did know. Everyone knew. Franklin's temper was legendary. His paranoia when things went wrong was even worse. Maybe he should see someone, I suggested gently. A therapist. Someone who can help him work through whatever's going on in his head. James agreed. Said he'd talk to Franklin. Left looking concerned, but not about me. About his brother. About Franklin's mental state. About whether the stress of his lifestyle had finally caught up with him. I closed the door and smiled. That night, Franklin didn't come home until after midnight. When he did, he was drunk. Stumbling, slurring, barely able to find his keys. He stood in the living room, swaying. You're destroying me, he said. You're taking everything from me.
No, Franklin.
I looked up from my book. You destroyed yourself. I'm just watching it happen. He lunged at me, tried to grab my throat. But he was drunk and slow, and I was ready. I stepped aside, and he crashed into the bookshelf, books tumbling down around him like his whole world was collapsing.
Which it was.
He lay on the floor, tangled in fallen books, and started to cry. Actually cry. Franklin Langford, who'd never shown weakness in his life, sobbed like a child. Please, he begged. Please just tell me if you poison me. I need to know. I can't live like this. Not knowing. Always afraid. Please, Marjorie. Please. I stood over him. This man who'd made me beg so many times. Who'd watched me cry and felt nothing but satisfaction. Who'd broken me down piece by piece until I forgot what it felt like to be whole. You can't just leave, I said softly. He looked up at me through tears.
Why?
Why won't you let me go? I bent down until we were eye level, until he could see exactly what was in my eyes. Not hatred, not even anger, just cold, clear satisfaction.
No, Franklin. You needed me.
You just never realized it until now. Franklin moved into the guest room, started cooking his own meals, stopped going to work. His business partners called constantly. His secretary showed up at the door, concerned. His brother came by twice more. Everyone was worried about Franklin Langford. No one knew what was wrong with him, but clearly something was very wrong. He'd lost weight, wasn't sleeping, jumped at shadows, flinched when I walked past him in the hallway, checked the locks on his bedroom door every night like I might sneak in and smother him in his sleep. I never did anything to him. That's the beautiful part. After that one Sunday morning coffee, I never touched his food again. Never added anything, never tampered with anything, never gave him any reason to be afraid. But he was afraid anyway, because fear, once it takes root, doesn't need fresh soil to grow. It feeds on itself, multiplies in the dark, becomes its own kind of poison that no doctor can detect. Sometimes karma doesn't need witnesses. Agree? Tap the heart if you do. His company started to fail. Without Franklin's focus, without his ruthless attention to every detail, deals fell through. Clients left. Money dried up. The business he'd built over 40 years, the business he'd used as an excuse to control everything in his life, began to crumble. His brother called one evening. I answered, since Franklin wasn't picking up his phone anymore. Marjorie, James said. I don't know what's happening, but Franklin's company is in serious trouble. He's going to lose everything if he doesn't get his act together. Can you talk to him? Can you help him? I've tried. I lied smoothly. But he won't listen to me. You know how Franklin is. He's never listened to me about anything. That part wasn't a lie. The lawyer's letter came on a Tuesday morning. Franklin was being sued by 3 different business partners for breach of contract, negligence, failure to fulfill obligations. The numbers in the lawsuit made my eyes water. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. More money than Franklin actually had. He was going to lose the company, lose the house, lose everything he'd spent his whole life building while tearing me down. I found him in his room, sitting on the bed, holding the letter with shaking hands. This is your fault, he said. No anger in his voice anymore. Just defeat. You did this to me.
No, Franklin.
You did this to yourself. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences. What does that mean? I sat down next to him. Not close, but close enough that he had to look at me. It means that for 37 years I covered for you. I smoothed over your mistakes. I apologized to people you offended. I held everything together while you tore everything apart. I was the foundation of your success, and you never even noticed. He stared at me. That's not true, isn't it? Who called your clients when you were too drunk or too angry to be professional? Who remembered birthdays and anniversaries and made sure gifts were sent? Who hosted the dinners where you made your biggest deals? Who smiled and made everyone comfortable even when you were being an ass? Silence. Because he knew. Deep down, he'd always known. He just never had to acknowledge it before. You were my wife, he finally said. That was your job. And hurting me was yours? More silence. The house went on the market the next month. Franklin didn't have a choice. The lawsuits were bleeding him dry. His company was finished. His reputation was destroyed. Everyone in Fairhaven was talking about Franklin Langford's spectacular fall from grace. Mental breakdown, they whispered. Stress finally got to him. Always knew he worked too hard.
Such a shame.
His poor wife must be devastated. I wasn't devastated. I was free. The day the for sale sign went up in our yard, I stood at the kitchen window and watched Franklin stare at it from his car. Saw his shoulders shake. Knew he was crying. I felt nothing.
No satisfaction. No revenge. No joy.
Just a calm, clear sense of completion. That night I made dinner. Real dinner, the kind I used to make when I still thought trying mattered. Pot roast with vegetables, fresh bread, apple pie for dessert. I knocked on Franklin's door. Dinner's ready. He opened it slowly. Looked at me with such suspicion. What did you do to it? Nothing, I said. I promise. Nothing at all. He didn't believe me. Followed me to the kitchen anyway, because he hadn't eaten a real meal in weeks and hunger was overriding fear. We sat at the table. The same table where we'd had thousands of meals over 37 years. Where he'd criticized my cooking, insulted my intelligence, made me feel small enough to disappear. He took a bite of pot roast. Chewed slowly. Waited to see if anything would happen. Nothing happened. He took another bite. Another. Started eating like a starving man, which I guess he was in more ways than one. It's good, he said quietly. It's really good. I know, I said. It always was. You just never noticed. He finished eating. Set down his fork. Looked at me across the table with red-rimmed eyes. Did you really poison me that Sunday? He asked. Or was it all in my head? I smiled. Stood up. Started clearing the dishes. Does it matter? Either way, fear did what I never could. In the end, fear did what I never could. It broke him. The truth is, I never poisoned Franklin at all. That Sunday morning, the powder I put in his coffee wasn't foxglove. It was nothing more dangerous than ground cinnamon mixed with a tiny bit of cayenne pepper. Enough to taste slightly off. Enough to make him pause. Enough to plant a seed of doubt. Everything else, all the fear, all the paranoia, all the destruction, Franklin did to himself. I just let him believe I was capable of killing him. And that belief, that tiny seed of fear watered by his own guilt and years of cruelty, grew into the poison that destroyed him from the inside out. The foxglove in my garden? Still there, still growing, still beautiful and deadly. I never touched it except that one time when I dried those leaves and ground them to powder. That powder sat in a different tin, clearly labeled poison, do not use, tucked in the back of the garage where no one would ever find it by accident. I wasn't a murderer. Never wanted to be. Never intended to be. I just wanted Franklin to know what it felt like to be afraid. To be powerless. To live every day wondering if this was the day everything would end. And now he knew. The house sold for less than it was worth. Franklin moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. His business was liquidated. His reputation was finished. Everything he'd spent his life building was gone. I moved into a small cottage near the state park. Nothing fancy. Just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with good light, and a garden plot that was waiting for me to fill it with growing things. I planted tomatoes first. Then herbs. Then flowers that bloomed in the shade and didn't need much attention. No foxglove, though. I'd learned my lesson about keeping beautiful, dangerous things around. Sometimes I see Franklin at the grocery store. He looks older now. Smaller. Like fear took up so much space inside him that there wasn't room for anything else. He never speaks to me. Just watches from a distance with those haunted eyes, probably still wondering if I really poisoned him or if he destroyed himself over nothing. I never tell him the truth. Never give him that comfort. Let him wonder. Let him fear. Let him live with uncertainty the way I lived with pain for 37 years. Is it cruel? Maybe. But it's also justice. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't wear handcuffs or stand in courtrooms. The kind that happens in kitchens and gardens and inside the minds of men who thought they were untouchable. People ask me sometimes if I regret what I did to Franklin. If I feel guilty for destroying his life. I don't. Because I didn't destroy his life. His cruelty destroyed his life. His arrogance. His absolute certainty that he could hurt someone forever without consequences. I was just the mirror that finally showed him what he really was. And when he looked into that mirror and saw a man capable of being poisoned by his own wife, saw a man who treated someone so badly that murder seemed like a reasonable response, he couldn't live with what he saw. That's not my fault. That's his truth finally catching up to him. I'm 61 years old now. I live alone. I grow things. I read books Franklin would have called a waste of time. I take walks in the park and feed the ducks and do whatever I want whenever I want to do it. I'm not afraid anymore. Not of footsteps behind me. Not of voices raised in anger. Not of hands that reach for me with violence instead of love. The only powder I use now is flour for baking and cocoa for chocolate cake. The only thing I cultivate is peace. And every morning, I wake up in my little cottage, make myself a cup of coffee, and smile. Because sometimes, justice doesn't need bloodshed. Sometimes it just needs a woman who's tired enough to stop being afraid and smart enough to let a guilty man's fear destroy him. Sometimes justice doesn't need poison. It just needs silence, patience, and the willingness to let karma do its work. Because sometimes justice doesn't wear handcuffs, it wears silence. If this story moved you, if it made you think about quiet strength and the power of standing up for yourself even in the smallest ways, subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories that challenge how we think about justice, survival, and finding freedom. Turn on notifications so you never miss these important lessons. And please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else who needs to hear that they're not alone. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. And together, we create a community where survivors can find strength. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.